My name is Emma. I'm in my mid-30s, and for most of my adult life, I've worked in roles where reliability mattered more than visibility. I've been called steady, dependable, someone you don't have to worry about. Those words sound like compliments, and for a long time, I accepted them as such. People usually assume I'm agreeable before they assume I'm capable, quiet before they consider competent. I don't dominate rooms. I don't interrupt. I don't advertise my value loudly or repeatedly. And because of that, I've often been underestimated. Not in dramatic ways, not with open hostility, but in subtle omissions. The kind that are easy to deny and harder to prove. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about winning. And it definitely isn't about exposing villains. It's about a slow realization I had over time. One that many people experience but rarely talk about honestly. It's about what happens when loyalty becomes a one-way expectation. When covering for someone quietly turns into being erased publicly. When you learn, a little too late, that doing the right thing doesn't always protect you, especially when no one is watching. I once covered for a colleague's mistakes. Not because I was forced to, not because I was afraid, but because I believed that professionalism meant protecting the team. That trust, once given, would eventually be returned. Instead, they took credit. And when that happened, no one rushed to correct the record, not even the people who knew better. What followed wasn't explosive. There were no shouting matches, no dramatic resignations, no viral moments. Just a long stretch of quiet where something inside me shifted, where I stopped explaining myself, where I started observing instead of reacting, where I learned the difference between being kind and being convenient. This is a story about emotional justice, not the kind that comes with applause, but the kind that arrives quietly, after you've made peace with the truth. It's about psychological reversal, not through confrontation, but through clarity. About realizing that silence can be a boundary, that distance can be a decision, and that sometimes the most powerful response is simply no longer participating in your own diminishment. Over the next few parts, I'll walk you through how it happened, how small moments stacked up, how I normalized things I shouldn't have, how loyalty slowly turned optional, at least for everyone except me, and how, without planning revenge or demanding recognition, I chose a different ending. I'm telling this honestly, without embellishment, without dramatizing anyone involved. Because if you've ever been the person who held things together behind the scenes, if you've ever been relied on but overlooked, if you've ever wondered whether staying quiet was strength or self-erasure, then you'll recognize yourself somewhere in this. So before we go any further, I want to ask you something. Gently, and without judgment. Have you ever stayed loyal to a situation that had already stopped being loyal to you? To them, I was reliable. That was the word that followed me into meetings I wasn't invited to, decisions I wasn't consulted on, and credits that never reached my name. Reliable. As if my presence was assumed rather than chosen. As if my contribution was part of the furniture. Useful. Expected. And ultimately invisible. I didn't start out invisible. None of us does. When I first joined the team, I brought energy, ideas, and a kind of careful enthusiasm that comes from wanting to do things well, not loudly. I asked questions. I followed through. I noticed gaps others skipped over. And for a while, that mattered. But over time, something subtle happened. My role solidified. Not on paper, but in people's minds. I became the one who fixed things quietly, the one who caught errors before they escalated, the one who stayed late without announcing it, who rewrote reports so deadlines wouldn't slip, who smoothed tensions so meetings could end on time. I wasn't asked if I wanted that role. It was assigned gradually through repetition. When something went wrong, people looked relieved when I said, "I'll handle it." When something went right, people assumed it always had. No one said, Emma will take care of it, with malice. It was said with comfort, with trust, with the confidence that I wouldn't make it about myself. And I didn't. I told myself that being low drama was a strength, that being steady in a volatile environment was valuable, that not needing recognition meant I was secure, mature, above politics. I watched others speak more than they listened, claim more than they built. I noticed how ideas traveled, how something I mentioned casually would reappear later, polished and louder, delivered by someone else. I noticed how credit tended to drift toward those who spoke last or loudest. And still I stayed quiet, because no one was unkind to me. That's the part people don't understand when I try to explain it. There were no insults, no open dismissals, just a pattern of assumptions. A growing certainty that I would always be there to catch what slipped through other people's fingers. In meetings, my name came up when something needed fixing, not when something needed vision. In emails, I was CC'd for execution, not strategy. In performance reviews, I was praised for consistency and support, words that sound safe until you realize they keep you exactly where you are. I became the person people leaned on without looking at. And because I didn't protest, they assumed consent. What they didn't see, or maybe didn't need to see, was that I was paying attention. I remembered who asked for help and who disappeared afterward, who benefited from my silence and who never questioned it. I noticed how often my work was treated as communal until it succeeded, and then quietly rebranded as individual achievement. Still, I told myself stories to make it make sense. This is how teams work. Not everything needs your name on it. Being dependable is its own reward. Those stories helped me sleep at night. They helped me ignore the small tightening in my chest when someone else accepted praise for something I had corrected at midnight. When my contribution was summarized as support, while others were labeled drivers. I wasn't angry then. That came later. Back then, I was something else, useful, trusted, and quietly taken for granted. I didn't yet understand that how people define you is often less about who you are and more about what you allow to happen without comment. At that stage, I thought staying invisible was the price of professionalism. I didn't know it was also the cost of being seen. The first time it happened, it was small enough to dismiss. That's important to say, because if it had been obvious, if it had been blatant or cruel, I might have reacted differently. I might have spoken up. I might have drawn a line early. But it wasn't like that. It was quiet, polite, almost accidental. We were in a weekly review meeting, the kind where everyone brings updates, and most people half listen while waiting for their turn to speak. A project had gone off track the week before, missed deadline, inconsistent data, a deliverable that hadn't met expectations. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to raise eyebrows. I knew exactly why it had happened. A colleague, someone I worked closely with, had misread a key requirement. I noticed it late one evening while double-checking figures. By then, fixing it would have meant pushing back the timeline and alerting leadership. Instead, I stayed, corrected the work, re-ran the analysis, reframed the summary so the mistake wouldn't be visible. I didn't announce that I had done it. I didn't think of it as rescuing anyone. I thought of it as protecting the project. So when the meeting came around, the revised results were presented. Clean, coherent, on time. My colleagues spoke confidently, walking through the outcomes. Leadership nodded. Someone said, "Nice recovery from last week." And then it happened. They said, "I took a closer look after the last review and tightened up the approach. Not we, not the team." The word landed softly, but it landed. I remember the exact sensation, not anger, not shock. More like a pause inside me. A moment where I thought, that's not quite true. But then another voice followed immediately. It's fine. It doesn't matter. The work is what counts. No one looked at me. No one questioned the statement. And why would they? From the outside, it sounded reasonable. The person responsible had corrected their own work. That's the story everyone expects. The meeting moved on. I didn't correct the record afterward. I didn't pull my colleague aside. I didn't send a follow-up email clarifying contributions. I told myself it would look petty. that would make me seem insecure, that it wasn't worth disrupting the atmosphere over a single word. But I noticed something else that day. The ease with which it was said. There was no hesitation, no glance in my direction, no acknowledgement that someone else had stayed late, fixed the issue, and absorbed the risk. The credit wasn't stolen dramatically, it was simply assumed, and because I stayed silent, that assumption settled. In the days that followed, nothing changed on the surface. My colleague remained friendly, grateful even, in a vague way. They said things like, "Thanks for being so on top of things," which felt less like appreciation and more like confirmation of a role. You handle the details. I handle the narrative. I replayed the moment more times than I care to admit. Not obsessively, but quietly, in the background of my thoughts. I asked myself whether I had imagined it, whether I was being overly sensitive, whether I should have spoken up or let it go. Everyone else had let it go. That's what made it easier to ignore and harder to forget. Because when no one reacts, you start questioning your own perception. You wonder if the cut was real, or if you're just noticing things too closely. You tell yourself that professionalism means absorbing small discomforts without complaint. So I did, but something subtle changed after that meeting. I became more aware of language, of pronouns, of how often I replaced we, of how often my effort existed only in the background, unspoken and therefore unprotected. That first small cut didn't hurt much, but it taught me where I was vulnerable. And once you know that, you start seeing the blade everywhere. After the first time, I told myself it was an exception. That's how normalization begins. Not with denial, but with generosity. You assume good intent. You widen your tolerance. You smooth over the moment internally so you don't have to disrupt anything externally. The next time, it didn't even register as a cut. More like a familiar pressure. Another project. Another late-stage correction. Another instance where I absorbed the mess so the final result could look seamless. And again, in the recap, my colleagues spoke as if the work had evolved naturally under their guidance. This time, there was a subtle addition. After reviewing things more carefully, I realized we needed to adjust the framework. I was the one who had reviewed it. Carefully. Twice. But the phrasing was clever. Ambiguous enough to include me in theory, specific enough to place ownership elsewhere. I noticed how easily language could be shaped to imply effort without naming it. No one objected. No one asked follow-up questions. The room moved on. And so did I. I started noticing how often I rationalized moments like these before they even finished happening. How quickly my mind jumped into protecting the situation. It's not malicious. They probably don't even realize how it sounds. If it mattered, someone would say something. That last one was the most dangerous, because silence from others started to feel like evidence that nothing was wrong. What I didn't realize then was that people often follow the most confident version of a story, not the most accurate one. And confidence doesn't always belong to the person who did the work. It belongs to the person willing to claim it. I stayed quiet because I didn't want to be seen as difficult, or territorial, or someone who kept score. I believed that my consistency would speak for itself over time, that eventually, patterns would be noticed, that someone would connect the dots. Instead, the pattern that formed was different. I became the safety net. When something was unclear, it landed on my desk. When something was late, I stayed to finish it. When something needed refinement, I was asked to take a look. But when something succeeded, it traveled upward without me. I normalized this by telling myself that leadership knew what I contributed, even if they didn't say it out loud. That my value was understood implicitly. That being indispensable was better than being visible. There's a quiet arrogance in that belief, I see now. The assumption that your effort is so obvious it doesn't need naming. That your absence would be felt even if your presence wasn't acknowledged. But what really happens is simpler. People adjust their expectations. They stop asking who did the work and start assuming who always will. And once that assumption sets in, correcting it feels disruptive. Almost rude. Like pointing out the scaffolding after the building is finished. I also began editing myself. I spoke less in meetings, not because I had nothing to say, but because I didn't want to sound repetitive. I framed ideas as questions instead of statements. I softened my language, made room for others to expand on it. And when they did, when my thoughts returned to me, sharpened and louder, I told myself it was collaboration. It took me a while to admit that collaboration doesn't erase authorship. By then, the dynamic had settled. People came to me when they needed things done right. They went to others when they wanted things seen. I wasn't angry yet. I was tired. Tired of carrying clarity without ownership. Tired of being dependable in ways that benefited everyone except me. Still, I stayed quiet, because speaking up would mean acknowledging something I wasn't ready to face. That loyalty, when it's unreciprocated, slowly teaches others how to treat you. And I had helped write that lesson myself. By the time I recognized the role, it had already been cast. Not in a meeting, not in an email, but in 1,000 small interactions that all pointed in the same direction. I was the person people relied on to make things work, not the one they expected to lead them forward. Reliable, useful, invisible. It became clear how tasks were framed. I wasn't asked, "What do you think we should do?" I was asked, "Can you help clean this up?" My input was sought after decisions were made, not before. My value was measured by how smoothly I could execute someone else's vision. And because I was good at it, the role stuck. There was an unspoken understanding that I would absorb complexity so others could remain uncomplicated. That I would translate chaos into order quietly, without needing acknowledgement. That I would protect the outcome, even if it meant disappearing from the story. I remember one particular moment that clarified everything. A manager was outlining responsibilities for an upcoming initiative. They spoke about leadership, visibility, and ownership. Names were assigned to strategic pieces. When it came to the execution-heavy portion, the part that would require precision, long hours, and attention to detail, they looked at me and said, "Emma will support." Support, not lead. Not co-own, support. The word wasn't meant to diminish me. I could hear that. It was said with trust, with relief, with the confidence that I wouldn't push back. And I didn't, because by then, I understood the expectation. I was there to ensure nothing broke, not to decide where things went. I was the quiet constant in a room full of moving parts. What struck me later wasn't the assignment itself. It was how natural it felt to everyone else. No one questioned whether I might want something different. No one asked if I had ambitions beyond holding things together. They didn't need to. I had shown them who I was willing to be. I realized then that roles aren't just assigned by others. They're reinforced by what we accept without comment. Every time I said yes without boundaries, every time I fixed something without naming it, every time I prioritized harmony over clarity, I was teaching people how to use me. And they learned quickly. I became the person people trusted with their mistakes. The one who would quietly correct, reframe, and absorb responsibility so no one else had to. That trust felt flattering at first, like proof of competence. But trust without credit is just extraction with better manners. I noticed how others guarded their visibility. How they made sure their names were attached to deliverables, even small ones. How they narrated their process out loud, turning effort into presence. I had done the opposite. I believed that letting the work speak for itself was a sign of integrity. What I hadn't considered was that work doesn't speak. People do. And the people who were speaking weren't saying my name. By the time I understood this, the role felt fixed. Like trying to change your seat after the show has started. Speaking up now would require rewriting a story everyone else had already memorized. So I stayed in place, but something inside me began to resist quietly. Not in anger, not in defiance, just in awareness. I started noticing the cost of being the reliable one. The way my energy was spent maintaining systems I didn't own. The way my loyalty was assumed, not earned. I saw clearly that I had been cast as the person who would always cover the cracks, without ever being seen as the architect. And once you see the role for what it is, you can't unsee it. You can only decide how long you're willing to keep playing it. The shift didn't happen during a confrontation. There was no argument, no raised voice, no moment where I finally stood up for myself in a way that anyone else noticed. From the outside, that day looked like any other. From the inside, it changed everything. It started with a routine request. An email, sent late in the afternoon, was marked urgent. A project was behind again, this time not because of confusion, but because of overconfidence. A colleague had promised results without checking feasibility. When reality didn't cooperate, the gap landed where it always did. With me, the message was polite, familiar. Can you take a look and see what can be done? No apology, no acknowledgement of how the situation had come to exist. Just the quiet assumption that I would step in and make it work. I opened the files. I reviewed the work. I saw the same pattern repeating itself. Loose claims, unverified numbers, conclusions that sounded good but couldn't survive scrutiny. I knew exactly how to fix it. I also knew what fixing it would cost me. Time, focus, another uncredited rescue. I sat there longer than usual, staring at the screen. Not because the problem was difficult, but because for the first time, I allowed myself to feel the weight of the pattern without explaining it away. I didn't feel angry. I felt tired in a new way, not the kind of tired that sleep fixes. The kind that comes from realizing you've been quietly subsidizing someone else's confidence. Your effort has been making it easier for others to overpromise, knowing someone else will absorb the fallout. What shifted that day wasn't my behavior. It was my interpretation. I stopped seeing the request as neutral. I stopped framing it as teamwork. I saw it for what it was, a test of whether I would continue playing the role without question. And in that moment, I understood something clearly and without drama. No one was going to stop this from me. There would be no realization from above, no sudden gratitude, no moment where someone said, "You've been carrying too much." The system was working exactly as designed. It rewarded visibility, not reliability, confidence, not correction. And as long as I kept protecting the outcome, there was no incentive for anyone else to change. That realization didn't make me want to confront anyone. It made me quiet. I closed the files. I didn't reply immediately. For the first time, I let the silence exist. That was the shift. Not refusal, not rebellion, just a pause where there used to be automatic compliance. In that pause, I noticed how often I had responded quickly to prove my value, how availability had become my currency, how being indispensable had slowly turned into being unacknowledged. I eventually replied, calmly, professionally. I asked questions instead of fixing things outright. I requested clarification. I pointed out constraints without offering immediate solutions. The tone was the same. The behavior was different, and something else changed too inside me. I stopped hoping this would resolve itself if I just stayed patient. I stopped believing that loyalty, on its own, created safety. I began to see that my silence had been read as agreement, not grace. That day didn't mark an ending. It marked the beginning of distance, of observation without emotional investment, of choosing when to engage instead of defaulting to yes. I didn't announce this shift. I didn't articulate it to anyone else, but I felt it settle, quietly and firmly. Like something aligning. From that day on, silence was no longer something that happened to me. It was something I chose. After that day, nothing looked different on the surface. I still attended the same meetings. I responded to emails. I delivered work on time. If anyone had been observing closely, they might have said I was as reliable as ever, maybe even more composed. What they wouldn't have seen was the decision underneath it all. My silence was no longer reflexive. It was deliberate. Before, I stayed quiet to keep the peace, to avoid friction, to be professional. Now I stayed quiet to gather information, to see how often people assumed I would step in, to understand who noticed when I didn't. And almost no one did. Requests continued to arrive framed in the same way. Vague urgency, minimal context, implicit expectation. But I stopped rushing to fill the gaps. I asked for clarity. I outlined timelines realistically. I named dependencies. I didn't volunteer solutions before problems were fully acknowledged. This subtle shift unsettled people more than any confrontation would have. When you stop cushioning mistakes, the edges become visible. I watched how others reacted when things took longer, when issues surfaced, instead of being smoothed over. When I didn't immediately translate chaos into order, they mistook my restraint for withdrawal, or worse, weakness. I could sense it in the tone of the messages. Slight impatience, gentle pressure disguised as humor. Just wanted to bump this. Any thoughts yet? As if speed had always been the measure of my worth, I responded calmly, on my terms. The truth was, I hadn't become less capable. I had become less available. And availability, I learned, had been the real currency all along. Without it, some people struggled. Meetings ran longer. Assumptions went uncorrected. The same colleague who once spoke confidently now hesitated more often, unsure whether someone else would catch what they missed. I said nothing, not because I wanted them to fail, but because I wasn't willing to disappear. They could look flawless. What surprised me most was how quickly people adjusted their expectations of me and of themselves. When I stopped absorbing responsibility automatically, others were forced to carry more of it. Some did, some didn't. And those differences became very clear. Silence gave me perspective. I started documenting, not out of spite, but out of clarity. I kept track of decisions, timelines, and ownership. Not to expose anyone, but to ground myself in reality. To counter the stories I had once told myself to justify staying quiet. I saw how often credit followed narration, how outcomes were claimed by those who spoke about them first, how invisibility was rarely accidental. It was convenient. Still, I didn't correct anyone publicly. I didn't rewrite the narrative yet. I was listening, letting people show me who they were when I stopped compensating. And in that space, I discovered something unsettling and freeing at the same time. My silence had never protected me. It had protected everyone else. Once I understood that, the guilt faded. I no longer felt responsible for maintaining illusions. I felt responsible only for my own integrity, for not lying to myself about what was happening, for choosing when to give and when to withhold. People began to fill the quiet with assumptions. Some thought I was disengaged. Some thought I was overwhelmed. A few even thought I was planning to leave. I let them think whatever they needed to, because for the first time I wasn't managing perceptions. I was managing myself, and that was enough. While everyone else adjusted to my new pace, I began preparing, not in a dramatic way. There were no secret meetings, no sudden declarations, just small, deliberate actions taken consistently, quietly over time. What they never noticed was how much I was learning. By stepping back from constant execution, I finally had the space to observe the system instead of propping it up. I paid attention to how decisions were made, who influenced them, and whose voices carried weight. I noticed how often leadership relied on secondhand summaries rather than primary work, how narratives traveled upward while details stayed below. I also noticed something else, how much institutional memory lived with me. I knew why certain processes existed, where previous attempts had failed, which shortcuts caused problems later. I remembered conversations others had forgotten. I held context that wasn't written anywhere. For years, I had treated that knowledge as communal, freely given, freely used. Now I treated it as leverage, not to control, but to protect myself. I began documenting everything: decisions, contributions, revisions. Not aggressively, just factually. I kept records of when I was asked to step in, what I fixed, and how outcomes were later described. This wasn't about building a case against anyone. It was about anchoring myself in truth. When you've spent years being quiet, it's easy to doubt your own memory. Documentation restores clarity. It tells you what actually happened, not just what people later claim. I also became more intentional about where I placed my effort. I stopped over-investing in work that would never be visible or valued. I focused on projects with clear ownership, defined outcomes, and traceable impact. If something was ambiguous, I asked for alignment up front. Some people found this inconvenient. They were used to me filling in gaps without comment. To me, smoothing things over before anyone else had to notice. Now, gaps stayed gaps until someone claimed them. I watched how often no one did. That told me more than any conversation could have. I also paid attention to patterns of credit, who consistently positioned themselves as the face of success, who avoided accountability when things went wrong, who used collaboration as a shield and independence as a spotlight. I didn't resent them for it. I just stopped enabling it. Quietly, I built relationships outside the narrow lane I had been assigned. I spoke directly with stakeholders who had only known me through intermediaries. I clarified my role, my scope, my contributions, without accusation, without defensiveness, just presence. What surprised me was how often people responded with curiosity rather than resistance. How many said things like, "I didn't realize you were involved in that," or, "I didn't know you handled that part." They weren't lying. They simply hadn't been told. For the first time, I saw how my silence had shaped other people's understanding. Not because they were malicious, but because information follows the paths we allow it to. I stopped assuming that being known was vanity. I started seeing it as accuracy. All the while, the colleague I had once covered for continued as before. Confident, articulate, unaware that the ground underneath them was slowly shifting. Because preparation doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need applause. It just waits. And the most important thing I prepared wasn't evidence or strategy. It was detachment. I stopped needing them to acknowledge what they had taken. I stopped waiting for fairness to arrive on its own. I accepted that loyalty, in this environment, was optional, and I adjusted accordingly. They never noticed the change because they were still benefiting from the old version of me in their minds. They didn't realize that the version no longer existed. The reveal didn't come from someone else. There was no email, no meeting, no sudden confession that confirmed what I already suspected. It came quietly, the way most truths do, when enough small facts line up and stop leaving room for doubt. I was reviewing documentation late one evening. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I had started doing that more often, revisiting past decisions, tracing outcomes back to their origins, noticing where the story had bent slightly each time it was retold. That night, something clicked. I saw the pattern clearly, without emotion attached to it. My colleague hadn't just taken credit once. They had built a reputation on a version of events that required my silence to remain intact. Their confidence wasn't rooted in deception so much as in repetition. They spoke first, consistently. They summarized outcomes in ways that centered themselves. And because I never corrected the narrative, it hardened into fact. What I realized then was simple and unsettling. If I disappeared tomorrow, the story of my contributions would disappear with me, not out of malice, out of convenience. That was the private reveal. Not that someone had wronged me, but that I had made myself erasable. I sat with that for a long time. Longer than I'd sat with any meeting or mistake, because it reframed everything. It explained why loyalty had felt so one-sided, why covering for someone else's errors had been treated as expected, not exceptional. Loyalty, I understood, only has value when it's visible to more than one person. Otherwise, it's just effort. I also realized something else in that moment. I had leverage, not in the dramatic sense, not in the form of secrets or threats, but in clarity, in records, in relationships that existed beyond the narrative that had been constructed around me, in the quiet credibility I had built with people who knew the work, even if they hadn't known the full story. And most importantly, I had leverage over myself. I no longer needed recognition from the person who had benefited from my silence. I no longer needed them to admit anything. The moment I stopped seeking acknowledgement from the wrong place, I became free to act differently. That clarity was sobering, not empowering. There was no satisfaction in it, no sense of victory, just a calm understanding that something had to change, and that it would not happen through confrontation. Confrontation would only invite denial. Or worse, token recognition that changed nothing structurally. What I needed wasn't an apology. It was authorship of my work, of my boundaries, of my next move. That night, I closed my notebook and didn't write anything new. I didn't plan. I didn't rehearse conversations. I didn't imagine outcomes. I simply accepted the truth as it was. That loyalty, when it's not reciprocal, becomes optional the moment you stop performing it. And that staying quiet had only ever benefited one version of the story. The next phase wouldn't be about exposure, it would be about choice. Once you see something clearly, you can't unknow it. The decision point didn't arrive with urgency. There was no deadline forcing my hand, no dramatic incident that demanded immediate action. In some ways, that made it harder. I had time, options, space to think. And space is where responsibility lives. I laid out the paths in front of me quietly, honestly. I could continue as I was, slightly more distant, slightly more guarded, but still within the same structure. That path required the least disruption. It would allow me to keep my reputation as dependable, calm, and low maintenance. It would also require me to accept that my work might never be fully attributed to me. I could confront my colleague directly. Name what had happened. Ask for acknowledgement. That path came with risk, defensiveness, denial, or surface-level apologies that didn't change behavior. Even if the conversation went well, it would position me as someone asking for fairness in a system that didn't reward it. Or I could do something else. I could stop shaping my decisions around how others might feel and start shaping them around what I needed to sustain myself. That third option was the hardest to define, but the easiest to feel. It wasn't about leaving immediately or making demands. It was about withdrawing consent, quietly, completely, from a dynamic that no longer served me. I thought about loyalty, about how often I had extended it without being asked, how rarely it had been returned in a way that protected me. I realized that loyalty, when unexamined, can become self-erasure dressed up as virtue. I didn't want to be virtuous anymore. I wanted to be accurate. Accurate about my contributions. Accurate about my limits. Accurate about the cost of staying where I was. The irreversible choice wasn't external. It was internal. I decided that I would no longer cover for anyone at the expense of my own visibility. I would no longer fix mistakes quietly and let others narrate the outcome. I would no longer assume that being helpful was the same as being respected. This wasn't a vow. It wasn't announced. It was a line drawn privately. And once drawn, it changed how I moved. I started declining requests that were framed vaguely or unfairly. I redirected responsibility back to its source. I insisted on clarity before action. I attached my name to my work, not loudly, not defensively, just factually. I also accepted that this might cost me relationships, that people who benefited from my silence might feel inconvenienced or even betrayed. I made peace with that before it happened, because the most irreversible decision you can make is to stop needing approval from the people who benefit from your compliance. Once that need dissolves, there's no going back. I didn't feel powerful. I felt steady, and that steadiness told me I had chosen the right path. After the decision, I didn't announce a change. I didn't need to. The most effective shifts rarely require witnesses. I continued working, but everything became more intentional. Every action had a boundary. Every agreement had a definition. I stopped filling in blanks that weren't mine to fill. When someone asked me to take a look, I asked what they wanted feedback on. When a deadline was unrealistic, I said so, calmly, early, without apology. When my work contributed to an outcome, I documented it clearly and shared it with the relevant people, not performatively. Precisely, this wasn't about self-promotion. It was about traceability. I also stopped protecting people from the consequences of their own assumptions. If someone misread requirements, I didn't rush to correct it behind the scenes. I flagged it. I named the risk. I let the process respond. This was the hardest part, not because I wanted anyone to fail, but because I had been trained to equate fixing with caring. Letting go felt like neglect, even when it wasn't. But every time I intervened less, the system revealed itself more. Leadership began asking different questions. Timelines shifted. Ownership became clearer, not because I demanded it, but because it could no longer be outsourced to my silence. And still, no one noticed me moving. That was the quiet dominance of it. My colleague continued as before, confident and articulate. They spoke in meetings with the same ease, still assuming outcomes would align with their narrative. They didn't realize that the buffer had thinned. The safety net had been folded away. I watched carefully, not for satisfaction, but for confirmation. I wanted to be sure that my absence from behind the scenes would change things in a measurable way. It did. Small inconsistencies began surfacing. Nothing dramatic, just enough to prompt follow-up questions, requests for clarification. Occasional delays that couldn't be explained away as external factors. I stayed composed. I answered questions when asked. I provided information without interpretation. I didn't rush to contextualize or soften. Facts speak clearly when they're allowed to stand. The most interesting part was how people reacted to this shift. Some adjusted quickly. They took more responsibility. They asked better questions. They engaged more thoughtfully. Others grew uneasy. They missed the old rhythm, the one where problems disappeared quietly, where confidence went unchallenged, where effort could remain invisible. I didn't correct their discomfort, because discomfort is often the first sign that a system is rebalancing. I also began preparing for outcomes beyond the immediate environment. I updated my professional materials. I reconnected with contacts who knew my work independently of the internal narrative. I didn't broadcast dissatisfaction. I simply made sure my story existed outside a single context. All of this happened quietly. No ultimatums, no confrontations, no emotional scenes, just movement. And movement, when done without noise, is difficult to stop. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They never do. They appeared gradually, like a system adjusting to the absence of a stabilizing force it didn't know it relied on. At first, it was subtle. A few follow-up questions in meetings that hadn't existed before. A request to walk through the logic instead of simply presenting conclusions. Small pauses where confidence used to carry things forward without challenge. No one said my name in those moments. They didn't need to. I could see the difference in how work landed when it hadn't been quietly corrected beforehand. My colleague began to hesitate more. Not because they had suddenly become less capable, but because the margin for error had narrowed. Without someone smoothing over inconsistencies, the work had to stand on its own. And sometimes it didn't. Leadership noticed, not in an accusatory way, but in a curious one. They asked for more details. They requested revisions. They slowed down decisions that used to move quickly. I remained steady. I answered when asked. I provided context when appropriate. I didn't volunteer explanations that weren't requested. This wasn't withholding. It was a restraint. The atmosphere shifted. What had once felt seamless now felt slightly strained. Timelines stretched. Assumptions were questioned. The ease that had come from invisible labor was gone, and no one could quite explain why. That's the thing about quiet contributors. You don't notice them until they stop compensating. People began feeling the loss without understanding its source. They talked about process issues and communication gaps. They speculated about external pressures. They didn't look inward yet, and they didn't look at me, not at first. I watched how my colleague responded, how they tried to fill the space with more confidence, more explanation, more narrative, how they spoke longer, louder, more often. But narrative only carries so far without substance. The system started asking for proof. For the first time, I saw how fragile the structure had been. How much it relied on unspoken labor to function smoothly. How easily credit had flowed when effort remained unseen. And how quickly things destabilized when it didn't. I felt no satisfaction watching this unfold. Only confirmation. Confirmation that I had not imagined my role. That my silence had indeed been doing work. Work that others now had to confront. I also noticed how some people began engaging with me differently. Asking for my input earlier. Looping me into discussions where decisions were actually being shaped. Not because I demanded it, but because it became necessary. Visibility followed absence. That irony stayed with me. The colleague I had once covered for didn't confront me. They didn't accuse me of withdrawing support. They didn't ask what had changed. They adjusted around me, not through me. And in that adjustment, the truth surfaced quietly. By the time anyone tried to fix it, the window had already closed. That's the part people often misunderstand. They imagine a single moment where someone realizes what they've done and rushes to make amends. But real dynamics don't work that way. They shift slowly, and once they settle, they resist reversal. The first sign of panic wasn't obvious. It came disguised as concern. Leadership began asking more pointed questions. Not accusatory, but persistent. They wanted explanations that held up under scrutiny. They asked for sources, for process, for accountability. What used to pass with confidence now requires substance. My colleagues struggled. I don't say that with judgment. I say it as an observation. They had built their rhythm around a system that absorbed errors quietly. Without that buffer, they had to confront gaps they hadn't realized were being managed for them. I stayed where I was, present, professional, detached. I didn't offer to step in. I didn't rush to rescue. I had already made that decision. Eventually, the concern reached me. Not directly at first. Indirect questions. Casual check-ins. How are things going from your side? Anything we should be aware of? I answered honestly. Factually, without editorializing. I described my scope, my responsibilities, the limits of my involvement. I didn't mention the past. I didn't recount moments of credit taken or silence maintained. There was no need. The system was already responding. At some point, someone realized that what was missing wasn't effort. It was alignment. That the work had been moving forward on assumptions that no longer held. They tried to reintroduce the old dynamic. Subtly, I was asked to support more closely, to help ensure consistency. The language was familiar, comfortable, safe. I declined, politely, clearly, not because I couldn't do it, but because doing it would re-establish the same imbalance. That was the moment it became too late. Not because I wanted it to be, but because trust, once eroded quietly, doesn't return through convenience. My colleagues sensed the shift then. I could see it in how they spoke to me. More cautious, more measured. There were hints of appreciation, perhaps even regret, but they came without ownership. And without ownership, there's nothing to rebuild on. I didn't confront them. I didn't explain my decision. I didn't need them to understand. Understanding wasn't required for consequences to exist. The system had already adjusted to a new normal, one where I was no longer compensating invisibly. Trying to undo that would require acknowledging the imbalance out loud. No one wanted to do that. So things continued, more slowly, more carefully, more honestly. The attempt to fix it came too late because it addressed the symptoms, not the structure. And I had already stepped outside that structure. The confrontation, when it finally came, was quiet. No raised voices, no dramatic pauses, no audience. It happened in a small meeting room on a gray afternoon, the kind of space designed for conversations that are meant to stay contained. My colleague asked if we could talk. Their tone was careful, not defensive, not aggressive, just uncertain. That alone told me how much had changed. They didn't start with an apology. They didn't accuse me of anything. They said, "I feel like something shifted between us and I'm not sure why." I let that sit for a moment. Not to create tension, but to be accurate. "Yes," I said, and something did. They looked relieved that I hadn't denied it. But relief quickly gave way to discomfort. Because acknowledgement opens doors that avoidance keeps closed. They talked for a few minutes. About pressure, expectations, how things had gotten complicated lately, about how work felt harder than it used to, how they missed the ease we once had. I listened. When they finished, I spoke carefully. I realized I had been doing work that wasn't visible, I said, and that I was allowing that to happen. That was it. No list of examples, no recounting of past meetings, no accusations about credit or intent, just a statement of fact. They tried to respond, to explain, to contextualize, to say they hadn't meant anything by it, that they appreciated me, that they assumed I was okay with how things were. "I know," I said. "That's the point." Silence followed, not uncomfortable, just honest. I didn't ask for anything. I didn't demand acknowledgement or a change in behavior. I didn't need promises, because the confrontation wasn't about resolution. It was about clarity. I wanted them to understand, not emotionally, but structurally, why the dynamic had ended. Why was I no longer available in the same way? Why things felt different? They nodded slowly. I could see the realization forming. Not guilt exactly, but recognition of how much they had relied on something they never fully saw. The conversation ended without a conclusion. No, we'll fix this. No, let's move forward together. Just an understanding that the old arrangement was gone. And that was enough. I left the room feeling lighter. Not because anything had been resolved, but because nothing had been distorted. I hadn't softened the truth. I hadn't escalated it either. I had simply named what was. Sometimes, that's the cleanest kind of confrontation. I am quieter now in a different way. Not less present, not less engaged, but no longer performing steadiness for the comfort of others. The silence I carry now isn't an absence, it's a boundary. I didn't leave immediately. That's important. This wasn't an escape, it was an integration. I stayed long enough to see the new dynamic hold, to confirm that my presence was now defined, not assumed. People interacted with me differently. They were more precise, more dire. They asked instead of expecting. Ted. When my name was attached to work, it stayed there. Not because I insisted, but because the system had learned that accuracy mattered. I also saw myself differently. For the first time, I didn't confuse being needed with being valued. I didn't equate helpfulness with belonging. I stopped deriving identity from how much I could absorb without complaint. That shift changed everything. I became more selective with my energy. I invested in work that reflected my values, not just my capacity. I allowed myself to be seen, not loudly, not performatively, but clearly. And I let go of the need to be liked for being easy. There's a quiet grief that comes with that. You lose a version of yourself that believed effort alone would protect you. That loyalty would be recognized eventually. Letting go of that belief feels like letting go of innocence. But in its place, something steadier forms. Self-respect. I no longer feel the urge to correct every misalignment or rescue every situation. I trust systems to reveal themselves. I trust people to show me who they are through patterns, not promises. And I trust myself to respond accordingly. The colleague I once covered for is no longer central to my story. They exist as a chapter, not a reference point. I don't carry resentment toward them. Resentment requires ongoing attachment. What I carry instead is discernment. I know now that loyalty is not a default. It's a choice that must be mutual to be sustainable. That silence can be powerful, but only when it's chosen, not endured. I didn't win anything dramatic, but I reclaimed authorship over my work, my time, and my presence. And that has been enough. I want to be clear about something before this ends. This story isn't a warning, and it isn't a blueprint. It's not meant to teach anyone how to outplay a colleague or reverse a power dynamic through strategy alone. What happened to me wasn't clever. It wasn't dramatic. It was simply honest, later than it should have been, but honest all the same. For a long time, I believed loyalty was something you proved by staying quiet, by covering gaps, by absorbing discomfort so others could move faster. I thought that being low maintenance made me trustworthy. What I learned instead is this. Loyalty without visibility is indistinguishable from consent to be overlooked. Not because people are cruel, but because systems follow the paths of least resistance. If your effort requires silence to function, it will eventually disappear into the background. Covering for my colleague didn't make me generous. It made me invisible. And when they took credit, it wasn't a betrayal in the dramatic sense. It was the predictable outcome of a structure I had helped sustain. That was the hardest truth to accept. Not that someone else had benefited unfairly, but that I had mistaken endurance for integrity. The shift didn't come from confrontation or exposure. It came from choice, from stepping back, from allowing reality to surface without cushioning it, from deciding that I no longer needed to be part of a story that erased me. Loyalty, I learned, is not optional because people are disloyal. It's optional because you are allowed to withdraw it when it stops being mutual. There's no villain in this story, just patterns, expectations, silence mistaken for strength. And clarity arrived quietly once it was finally invited. If there's a moral here, it's not speak up sooner or protect yourself at all costs. It's this: be precise about where your effort goes. Be honest about who benefits from your silence. And never assume that being essential means being seen. Sometimes, the most self-respecting thing you can do is stop covering for someone who has learned to stand in the space you've been holding for them. And sometimes, the quietest exit is the one that changes you the most. Before I go, I want to ask you something. Because if this story resonated, it's likely for a reason. Have you ever stayed loyal long after it stopped being mutual? And if so, what finally made you reconsider? I'll be reading your thoughts in the comments.